The first time my uncle laughed after my grandfather died wasn't at a family memory. It wasn't during the funeral luncheon. It wasn't because someone told an old fishing story. He laughed while standing on Grandpa's front porch, holding a brand new set of house keys. He jingled them in front of everyone and said, "Well, looks like this old place finally belongs to somebody who knows how to use it." A few of my cousins chuckled awkwardly. My mother looked at the ground. Nobody said a word. I stood there holding the folded American flag that had been presented to our family at Grandpa's funeral. My grandfather had served 4 years in the Navy. He loved this country. He loved his family. And more than anything, he loved that lake house in northern Michigan. He built it himself, one summer at a time. Every deckboard, every cedar beam, every stone in the fireplace had a story. To Grandpa, it wasn't property, it was home. My uncle, Richard, saw something different. He saw lakefront real estate worth nearly $3 million. As he slipped the keys into his pocket, he smiled at me. "Don't worry, Jake. I'll let you visit once in a while." That was the moment I almost told him. Almost. I almost reached into my jacket, pulled out Grandpa's handwritten letter, and showed him the sentence that would change everything. Instead, I folded the letter again, put it back into my pocket, and simply said, "We'll see." 7 days later, inside a Michigan probate courtroom, the judge read one sentence hidden inside Grandpa's trust. My uncle's smile disappeared forever. "My name is Jake Morrison. I'm 46 years old. I live just outside Traverse City, Michigan, with my wife, Sarah. We've been married for 22 years. We have one daughter, Emma, who's finishing graduate school. I'm not rich, never have been. I own a small HVAC company with 12 employees. Most weeks I'm covered in dust, grease, and insulation. That's honest work. Grandpa always respected honest work. He used to say, 'A paycheck feels different when your hands hurt earning it.' He wasn't wrong. My grandfather, William Morrison, wasn't famous. He wasn't a millionaire. He wasn't the kind of man whose picture ended up in newspapers. But if you asked anyone in our county who they trusted, his name always came up. He served on the volunteer fire department for 25 years. He coached Little League. He donated anonymously to struggling families every Christmas. And every Saturday morning, he invited anyone who wanted breakfast to the lake house. Sometimes 20 people showed up, sometimes only 3. It didn't matter. The bacon was hot, the coffee was fresh, and Grandpa always had another story to tell. The lake house sat on nearly 40 acres overlooking Crystal Lake. No gated entrance, no security cameras, just towering pine trees, an old wooden dock, and a porch that wrapped around the entire front of the house. Every summer of my childhood spent there. Grandpa taught me how to fish before I learned long division. He taught me how to split firewood, how to repair a dock after winter ice, how to shake a man's hand, how to keep my word. He'd always tell me, "Jake, one day this house won't matter. The people sitting on this porch will." Back then, I didn't understand what he meant. Now, those words echoed in my head every time I drove past the property. My Uncle Richard never cared much for those lessons. Richard was Grandpa's oldest son, charismatic, smooth-talking, always dressed like he was about to close a $1 million deal. He bounced from one business venture to another: restaurants, boat rentals, vacation cabins, real estate flipping. Some worked, most didn't. Whenever one failed, Grandpa quietly helped him back on his feet. Not because Richard deserved it, because Grandpa couldn't bear watching his own son struggle. But over the years, the help became expected, not appreciated. I remember one conversation 5 years before Grandpa died. We were replacing boards on the dock. Richard pulled up in a brand new luxury SUV. He walked down carrying expensive sunglasses and a cup of gourmet coffee. He looked around the property and whistled. "Dad, you know what this land's worth?" Grandpa kept hammering nails. "More than when I bought it." Richard laughed. "No kidding. You could sell this place tomorrow for a fortune." Grandpa stopped hammering. He looked across the water, then quietly answered, "If you only see the price, you've never really seen this place." Richard rolled his eyes. I never forgot that moment. Neither did Grandpa. The winter Grandpa passed was unusually cold. The doctors called it pneumonia. He called it my time. Even in the hospital, he refused to complain. He joked with nurses, asked about their families, thanked every orderly who entered his room. The last evening I spent with him, he motioned for me to move my chair closer. "Jake?" "Yes, Grandpa?" He smiled. "Take care of your mom." "I will." "Take care of Sarah and Emma." "Always." Then his smile became more serious. "And whatever happens after I'm gone, don't fight for my things. Fight for what's right." I nodded, not realizing those would be the last words he'd ever speak to me. The funeral was held 3 days later. It was exactly the kind of service Grandpa would have wanted. Simple, respectful. No extravagant flowers, no expensive displays. Just family, old friends, and neighbors whose lives he'd quietly touched over the years. The church was filled beyond capacity. Retired firefighters stood shoulder to shoulder with veterans. Local business owners sat beside mechanics, teachers, and farmers. People who had nothing in common except one thing. Every one of them had a story about Grandpa. One man stood during the reception afterward. "I lost my job in 2009, he said, his voice shaking. "I never told anyone except Bill. The next morning, I found an envelope in my mailbox. It had exactly enough cash to cover my mortgage. I asked him years later if it was him. He just smiled and changed the subject." The room grew quiet. Then another woman spoke. "When my husband was battling cancer, someone paid every hospital parking bill for 6 months. I found out after Bill passed that it was him." Story after story filled the afternoon. Grandpa had spent his entire life helping people without expecting a pause. Meanwhile, my Uncle Richard barely looked up from his phone. He kept stepping outside to answer calls. I overheard fragments as I walked past. "Yeah, I'll know by next week. Prime waterfront. Could be worth over $3 million. Perfect investment property." He wasn't talking about memories. He was talking about the lake house. After the luncheon, everyone slowly drifted toward the property one last time. The lake was calm. A cold breeze moved across the water. The dock creaked softly against the waves. I stood there remembering summers with Grandpa, fishing before sunrise, cleaning bluegill together, listening to him whistle while he repaired old wooden chairs. Sarah slipped her hand into mine. "You okay?" I nodded. "I keep expecting him to walk out onto the porch." She smiled sadly. "So do I." Before I could answer, an SUV pulled into the driveway. Richard climbed out carrying a large cardboard box. Behind him were 2 movers. I frowned. "What are they doing here?" Richard smiled. "Getting started." "Getting started with what?" "My new place." The words hit like a punch. My mother stared at him. "Richard, the funeral just ended." So maybe this isn't the time." He shrugged. Life moves on. Then he turned toward the movers. Take the boxes upstairs. I stepped in front of them. You can't move in. Richard folded his arms. And why not? The estate hasn't even gone through probate. He smirked. You really think Dad wanted this place sitting empty? Until the attorney says otherwise, nobody owns it. Richard leaned closer. I've already talked to someone. What someone? My lawyer. I noticed he never said Grandpa's attorney, just my lawyer. That told me everything. Mom's voice cracked. Please, not today. Richard dramatically sighed. Fine. He waved the movers back toward the truck. But I'm coming back tomorrow. Then he looked directly at me. Better get used to it. That evening, Sarah and I drove home in silence. Halfway there, she finally asked, What aren't you telling me? I looked over. What do you mean? You've been carrying something around all day. I hesitated, then reached into my jacket. Carefully, I unfolded Grandpa's last handwritten note. Sarah read it twice, then looked back at me. He gave you this? The night before he died. She frowned. Why didn't you tell anyone? I promised him. The note wasn't a will. It wasn't legally binding. It contained only one sentence. Trust David Mills. He knows where the truth is. David Mills was Grandpa's estate attorney. Nothing else. No explanation, no details. Just that one sentence. Sarah looked thoughtful. You think it means something? I honestly don't know, but Grandpa never wasted words. The next morning, my phone rang at 6:18. It was our neighbor, Frank. Jake, you better get over here. My stomach tightened. What happened? Richard's here. So? He changed every lock. I didn't answer. Frank continued. He brought a locksmith before sunrise. I figured you'd want to know. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the gravel driveway. Richard was standing on the porch, coffee in one hand, brand new keys spinning around his finger. He looked perfectly relaxed, like he'd lived there for years. I climbed out of my truck. What are you doing? He smiled. Protecting family property. You don't own this house. I will. That's not how probate works. He laughed. Oh, Jake, always playing by the rules. He tossed me a sarcastic smile. Sometimes you have to take control. I walked toward the front door. The key Grandpa had given me years ago no longer worked. Richard watched me struggle, then grinned. Guess that one's obsolete. He stepped closer, until we were only a few feet apart. I've already moved some of my furniture in. You broke into Grandpa's bedroom? It's my bedroom now. Those 5 words made my blood boil. But Grandpa's last conversation echoed in my mind. Fight for what's right. Not for my pride, not for revenge. For what's right. So, instead of arguing, I simply stepped back. Richard looked confused. That's it? You're just leaving? I nodded. For now. He laughed loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. I figured you'd quit. Then came the sentence I'll never forget. You're too soft to win anything. I got back into my truck. Frank looked disappointed. You're really walking away? I smiled slightly. No, I'm just letting him make every mistake he wants. Frank raised an eyebrow. What does that mean? I looked at Grandpa's folded note resting on the passenger seat. Trust David Mills. I think it's finally time to call Grandpa's attorney. I started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced once last time in the rearview mirror. Richard was already carrying boxes into the house, completely confident, completely unaware that Grandpa had spent years planning for exactly this kind of moment. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Grandpa sitting on the porch, coffee in one hand, smiling at the sunrise over Crystal Lake. By 7 the next morning, I was parked outside the office of David Mills, the attorney Grandpa had trusted for more than 30 years. The office wasn't fancy. Brick walls, a faded American flag near the entrance, family photographs instead of expensive artwork. It felt exactly like something Grandpa would have chosen. When I stepped inside, David looked up from a stack of files. His expression softened. "Jake, I've been expecting you." That caught me off guard. "You knew I'd come?" He smiled. "Your grandfather knew his family better than anyone. He told me there was a good chance someone would try to take the lake house before probate." I slowly reached into my jacket and placed Grandpa's handwritten note on his desk. David looked at it and nodded. "So, he gave you this. You know what it means?" "I do." He opened a locked drawer and removed a thick blue binder labeled the William Morrison Family Trust. He gently placed it on the desk. "Your grandfather left something most families never think about." "What?" "A plan." David opened the binder to the final section. "There are 3 amendments to the trust." "I've seen the trust before," I said. "My mom mentioned it years ago." David nodded. "You've seen the public sections. What you haven't seen is the final amendment." He slid one page toward me. At the top, in bold letters, were the words, "Lake House Preservation Clause." I frowned. "I've never heard of this." "Neither has Richard." David leaned back in his chair. "Your grandfather wasn't worried about taxes. He wasn't worried about probate. He was worried about greed." Those words stayed with me. He believed money changes people, so he wrote one final rule. I looked down at the document. The clause read, "No beneficiary who attempts to occupy, sell, mortgage, lease, or claim exclusive ownership of the lake house before the lawful completion of probate shall immediately lose every interest granted under this trust." I looked up. "That's incredibly specific." David chuckled. "Your grandfather said Richard would probably prove him right." For the first time since Grandpa passed, I laughed. It sounded strange, but it also felt like something Grandpa would have wanted. David continued, "There's more." He pointed farther down the page. "The forfeited share shall be transferred equally among the remaining beneficiaries, and the appointed family trustee shall oversee the property for future generations." I stared at him. "Family trustee?" David nodded. "That's you." I sat there speechless. "Why me?" David smiled. "Because you never asked him for anything. He watched you for years. You repaired the dock, you shoveled the driveway, you fixed the furnace, you took him to doctor's appointments. You never once asked what the property was worth. He noticed." I felt my throat tighten. I hadn't done those things for an inheritance. I did them because he was Grandpa. 1 week later, the probate hearing began. The courtroom in Traverse City was full. Family members filled nearly every seat. Richard arrived wearing a custom-tailored suit. He looked confident, almost relaxed. He smiled at a few relatives as though he'd already won. When he saw me, he walked over. "So, you ready to hand over the keys?" I looked him in the eye. "I never had them." He laughed. "You should have hired a better lawyer." I simply smiled. "No, I trusted Grandpa's." Judge Eleanor Brooks entered the courtroom. Everyone stood. After the usual formalities, David presented the trust. Richard's attorney immediately objected. "My client has already taken possession of the property." Judge Brooks adjusted her glasses. "Possession is not ownership." She continued reading. Then she reached the final amendment. The room became completely silent. Richard still looked relaxed until she began reading aloud. Lake House Preservation Clause. I watched his expression slowly change. Confusion, concern, then fear. The judge continued. Any beneficiary attempting to occupy or claim exclusive ownership before probate automatically forfeits all inheritance rights connected to this trust. Richard's attorney quickly stood. Your Honor, my client was not aware of this amendment. Judge Brooks calmly replied, ignorance does not invalidate a properly executed trust. She turned another page. The evidence submitted includes photographs showing Mr. Richard Morrison changing the locks and moving personal belongings into the residence before probate. David quietly placed several photographs on the evidence table. The locksmith's invoice, security camera images from a neighbor, receipts dated the morning after the funeral. Every timeline matched. Richard slowly lowered his head. Then, something happened no one expected. Richard stood, not to argue, not to protest. He looked at the judge, then at me. Finally, he looked towards the empty chair where Grandpa would have sat if he were still alive. His voice cracked. I spent my whole life trying to impress him. I thought if I owned that house, it would finally mean he'd chosen me. The courtroom fell silent. He wiped his eyes. I was wrong. I stopped seeing my father. I only saw his property. No one spoke. Even the judge waited. Richard turned towards me. I'm sorry, Jake. I should have been grieving with you. Instead, I was measuring square footage. Judge Brooks signed the final order. The Lake House Preservation Clause is valid. Mr. Richard Morrison forfeits his individual inheritance under the trust. The property shall remain in the Morrison Family Preservation Trust. The gavel came down. It is so ordered. Outside the courthouse, reporters weren't waiting. There were no television cameras. Just family. Real life doesn't always end with applause. Sometimes it ends with quiet. Richard walked towards his truck carrying only one small box. I caught up with him. Richard? He stopped. I know Grandpa would have wanted you at the lake. He looked confused. I don't own it anymore. You don't have to. He stared at me. As long as I'm trustee, you're welcome there. His eyes filled with tears. After everything I did? I nodded. Grandpa built that place for family. I'm not going to be the one who changes that. 3 months later, summer arrived. For the first time since Grandpa's funeral, the whole family gathered at the lake house. Kids ran down the dock chasing fireflies. My wife Sarah laughed with my mom in the kitchen, while fresh blueberry pie cooled on the counter. Richard stood beside the old cedar bench Grandpa had built decades earlier. He looked different, lighter. He wasn't talking about real estate values anymore. He was teaching my grandson how to cast a fishing line. I walked onto the porch carrying 2 mugs of coffee. I handed one to him. He smiled. You know, Dad would have laughed if he saw us. I nodded. He probably is. That evening, just before sunset, everyone gathered by the water. I unfolded the old handwritten note Grandpa had given me in the hospital. This time, I read it aloud. Fight for what's right. Not for money, not for pride, not to win. Just for what's right. The lake grew quiet. A bald eagle drifted over the shoreline. For a moment, it felt like Grandpa was still there, sitting in his favorite chair with a coffee mug in one hand, watching his family finally become whole again. Years later, my grandchildren wouldn't remember the court hearing. They wouldn't remember the legal documents or the hidden clause. They would remember fishing on Crystal Lake, bonfires under the stars, Christmas mornings by the stone fireplace, and cousins laughing together on the same porch Grandpa built with his own hands. That's when I finally understood what he'd been protecting all along. It was never the lake house, it was the family inside it.